Good afternoon, friends, loved ones, family, all of you great people across the world. We are lighting the candle, a world that works, and I'm Bill Carell. I'm part of the host team here, and to my left, I'll just do a quick introduction, and we'll pass it around. Is Ken Caputo, and then above Ken is Lisa Sheehan, and then Jan Jeremias, who we've got a nice stable table here with four strong legs. I actually feel so. We get together mostly weekly, and then last week we recorded um, our 100th uh, podcast episode for lighting the candle, the world that works.
Woohoo!
Yeah, I know, isn't that's fun? And so, Ken, what does that mean?
Uh, Means we keep going.
Not much, right?
whenever,
So
whenever, whenever something significant would happen in one of my lessons, my mentor, my teacher would immediately say, "What was that?" And my response would be, "Nothing special."
yep.
And just continuing to find that, just balance and move forwards. But you take a moment to celebrate the milestones because they're definitely worth celebrating, and then back to work.
Yes, all kidding aside, there's a lot of hours of dedicated conversation that have gone into getting us to this point. And then we also recognize that it's not a good thing to stand on our laurels of what worked in another episode. So we're constantly generating new conversation that's geared towards empowering us first. We'll know we're getting it done if we're empowered. And then you, our dedicated listeners that we know, like, and trust. And as a result of us having these conversations, maybe the world looks a little bit better for a time, or there's an opportunity to take some useful conversational bits that we've given you, because we get to cover almost every angle of what people can know to some degree. We're at least skimming along the surface of it. So, in keeping with our tradition of kind of picking a word or two, there's something that's coming up for me today. And I think the first one is equilibrium. And the second one is integration. And from that standpoint, I will kind of defer to somebody else who wants to pick it up. But I'm tossing out the two words for us to really get into and distinguish and see what conclusions or ideas we can bring on the table here today. Equilibrium and integration.
I was going to look it up, but the second you said equilibrium, because I thought of that, we've talked about balance, or I brought up homeostasis, or getting back to the center of things. So, and
Yeah.
God knows it's in nature, and God knows it's not in nature as well. So, um, but I'll look it up. But that's the first thing that came back to me is like getting back to center. And there's so many different words in the English language for that kind of thing.
Yeah. I've got a mind picture of shaking up a bottle with water and maybe some liquid soap in it. And what happens is as you shake it, it changes the state of the water, into kind of a plasma of bubbles and that sort of thing. But over time, it dissipates and goes back to looking just like clear water again. So it's out of balance, or not in equilibrium after it's been shaken, and it potentially has the ability to go back and be in that state again as soon as somebody acts on it. And
Um, right away, Bill, as you say that though, I thought of your second word of integration, and that water is somewhat. If you ever notice, it's always a little cloudier. Like it's never absolutely clear. So there is some soap that is then integrated into that liquid, and so therefore, you know, that base is not the same. The base, whatever the base element we might say is water, is not exactly the same as it was previously.
I think that's brilliant. And then, yes, and if you let it sit long enough, you'll actually see the water start to separate from the soap again. So the soap starts congealing with itself into a layer. Sometimes it's, it's specific gravity is less than water and it sits on top, or it's heavier than water and it sits on the bottom. And you'll definitely see that with like Italian dressing and three different stratas with oil, water, and vinegar in that. So it's kind of a neat thing to regard almost everything as having the potential of these two words that we're talking about, uh, from our daily conversations to what's going on in the world. And I'm really interested in hearing, Lisa, what definitions you've got.
Well, Oxford declares it to be a state in which opposing forces or influences are balanced. So I think opposing is the interesting word there too.
Yeah, almost a mind picture of a pendulum that sooner or later, once set into motion, swings out to the right and to the left or wherever it does swing. And then after a time, left on its own, it sort of stops at some point where it's no longer moving until it gets put into motion again.
And apparently something should not be mixed because I used to be madly in love with Jello 123. I don't know if you ever remember that.
Do you ever
But it
make
created
popsicles with it?
layers, but apparently there was something unhealthy in one of the layers, so they had to take it off the market.
Isn't that the way it always goes? The thing
Yep.
that's the best. Upon further reflection and testing here, this probably shouldn't be on the market.
There's no equilibrium here.
Exactly. So integration. What do y'all have for integration?
No, let me look that. I could spell. So Oxford says the action or process of integrating. I hate when they're like that.
That's not helpful.
Yeah. Is there more?
um, well, it says the act or process of uniting different things.
Yeah.
So that's uniting. What was the word of the other one?
Equilibrium?
Yeah. It wasn't
And
uniting. Was it unite? It wasn't uniting.
no, integration.
It was
And again,
of opposing. Yeah, and this is different things. Yeah.
sure. If you think about the components of first the soap and the water, and then the Italian dressing, and Italian dressing is really cool because it's got solids in it as well. It's little bits of onion and garlic, and I don't know, maybe some oregano or perhaps our favorite basil. You never know, right? All of those things, if you shake it up really well, um, you will equally disperse it for a moment on top of your salad and have an integrated Italian dressing. So integration, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily imply anything. There's no inference that I take from it except for if you're talking about, from a personality standpoint, the integration of people's personas. We went through, I don't know, the 60s and the 70s where we got taught that the roles that we needed to play in different parts of our lives needed to be different at work than it was at home with the children, different at church, all of those sorts of things. And then in the 90s and the early 2000s, we started talking about how disruptive that is for somebody who is trying to figure out which role model this moment called for, as opposed to just integrating all of the things that work and don't work about you into whoever you are authentically. We went back to that old authenticity and genuine, way of thinking about things. But there's another thing I think that's really kind of powerful about it too. From integration, we also get the word integrity. And what I love our language because there are just so many different ways that every single word can be used correctly. It's like, how can you ever find somebody wrong for using a word that you've never heard of? You know what I mean? So, Ken, what are your thoughts on equilibrium and integration?
Equilibrium just makes me think of the Tao, and the many conversations I've had with Taoists and Buddhists about just that idea of things are working towards that state as best they can, and you don't really achieve it. It's like you're not really in balance. It's just things
Yeah,
are pushing and pulling, and the more well they kind of match up, the more you get that temporary illusion of balance. So, it's interesting in Tai Chi, there's this practice called push hands. And, one of the things you're actually looking to do is they call it creating silk, which, comes from the idea of if you were to, pulling silk meant that you had to have a steady amount of pressure. And if you pull too fast or too hard, it would break, the strand would break. And if you pull too slow, it would clump. So in push hands, it was the right amount of tension between the two players, and you could move for hours like that with this connection. And the idea was not for the connection not to break. So when someone pushes hard, you had to yield more effectively to that. If they didn't push as hard, you had to adjust your yielding to maintain the flow.
yeah,
So it just seems like to me, it was always a very powerful way to pay attention. So instead of, like right now, if you listen to a lot of like political rhetoric, it's hard pushing or hard pulling as a counter, instead of how do we create, equilibrium through the right amount of tension, in response. So, but no one's trying to do that. They're just trying to knock each other down, or not engage at all, one or the other. So, and I remember when I started learning push hands at first, I had that mindset of I have to win by either moving them or not being moved, instead of paying attention to the equilibrium we were creating together and challenging each other to get more and more skilled at that.
yeah.
So, and it was a lot more fun that way. So, you
That,
know,
As you say that, Ken, in the style of yoga I practice, we have what we call muscular energy and organic energy. Muscular energy is when you draw energy in, so from the periphery to the core, so from skin to muscle to bone, and you hug in. And organic energy is more expansive, and you need both in a yoga pose. You need to pull in to
mm,
actually engage the muscles. And so, almost if you were to even think about it from the outside world coming in, and then as you expand out, you're going from the inside out. So, but it's also a balance between both. It's a balance between organic energy and muscular energy.
mm,
and
And if
I
you
would
choose,
imagine that there's when you're in a stable pose like that from the outside, someone might look very still, but the experience of the person is all of these micro tremors and this dynamic work to
that's right.
maintain that illusion of stillness, right?
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's a really beautiful way to practice because it is very, it's very similar to drawing a yantra. If you've ever drawn a yantra, which is like a geometric meditation shape, you start with lines and you start from the outside lines and you work your way into the very small. And then when you color it or paint it, you start from the inside and you work your way out.
mm,
Mm.
But I think the what you were saying, what I'm saying, and then when you go to the word integration, and when Lisa read integration, it says the action of integrating. So integration almost seems like a very, I don't know, it's like a participatory thing in some way, like it's active.
yeah. I love that too. And the example that you gave, Ken, is something that I've seen demonstrated to large groups of people, the difference between power and force, where force is one person trying to get somebody else to do, like the demonstration that John used to do, where he would start off by saying, "We're now going to do a little demonstration that because you're half my size and you weigh 60 pounds less than I do, is going to make you look very good, but it's going to make me look very bad." And so it starts off with, do me a favor, come over here and just push me over. And of course, this uh, smaller person couldn't do that. And he said, well, I'm going to show you how, even though you're half my size, I can't push you over. It was a very small, subtle thing that had to do with turning the heels just a
Hmm.
little bit, so that no matter how big the person is who's pushing on you, you ain't going anywhere, you know? So the whole idea between power and force, if somebody is trying to knock you over by pushing you, your first thought is to push back against them. And the actual training to take away from that is no, the power is in your heel. Once you have cocked your heel just this little tiny bit, you are now unmessable. There was that one, and then there was another one that came to mind while we were thinking, while you were talking about, the silk pushing and pulling, and two people working the motion together in Tai Chi. Um, where the demonstration was uh, two people pushing as hard as they could with each other, and then changing it to the model of now let's cooperate. And where I move my hands, you move your hands along with me. And I move my feet, it turned into a dance.
Hmm.
It turned into this marvelous co-creation of two human beings being in each other's space in a very, very powerful way, and creating something that neither one of them could do alone. And the difference between the force of trying to cause somebody to do something through your acting on them, and then power, which is when two objects integrate into one and create this new, uh, kind of a new state for them to be in, that is not only beautiful, but it actually creates something.
The other one that's kind of interesting, and you see this in acupuncture as well, and we would use it mechanically, is when you're trying to work on a movement, let's say, and you're struggling with it. The question John would ask me is, what's overworking or what's underworking?
Right.
And and that's what they do in acupuncture. It's like your liver's designed to work in this certain range to be functioning correctly. If it's underworking, that's going to cause some symptoms, but it can also be overworking. So so again, now you're back to equilibrium, is when you find that range where it's able to function the way it was designed to function. And I think a lot of times that's where I've just really been paying attention to the way people talk and the things they're upset about right now or passionate about or whatever. And generally speaking, it's they're not focusing on what would allow that equilibrium to manifest. It's just you know pointing out what's underworking or what's overworking without really thinking about moving towards a range. It's over pushing or under pulling, that kind of thing. So it's just kind of interesting how you just end up with a totally different experience and conversation if you're starting from a place of what creates balance, and that being like someone said the best negotiations are when everyone agrees but no one's really happy. you know it's like, yeah. I always like that because it's true. I mean, if you feel like you won, someone else probably lost, in the process of that. And did you really, were you committed to equilibrium, or were you just committed to getting what you wanted? So, and what's the price of that? That's now going to ripple down the road and create a second or third order consequence. And now you're going to have another overconnect correction, and things just keep getting more and more out of balance.
It's what's really cool about our conversation every week is you get to choose your metaphor, and you get to
Yeah.
use the metaphor in any manner that seems to work for you. And I just think it's brilliant that, we went through the Gordon Gekko 1980s with everything being a zero sum game where there have to be winners and there have to be losers, to a man named Stephen Covey, who comes out with the 7 habits of highly effective people. And the goal is now no longer to win or lose. The goal is now to treat every opportunity of synchronicity and uh, win-win. Go for win-win or no deal. No deal means no loss of power. And so I completely love the different ways that you can use every metaphor that's been brought in over a lifetime in different circumstances, kind of like the tools in my basement. I got a lot of tools in my basement. I rarely use most of them, but they're there if I need them.
And I was thinking about the physical aspect too, or this equilibrium and homeostasis and all those terms sound like the ideal situation, but like the things I've been listening and watching lately is like the body and the brain need to be pushed once in a while. They need to be activated and they need to be strained almost to another point. Otherwise, there's no growth. So that's physical and mental. So, I mean, I think what we've experienced lately, especially with conversations, is that people are overcompensating for things that they feel. Like Ken was saying, you're not getting to the middle road. You have to make your point even stronger. And that's why. And we've talked about this, that all we hear are the two extremes and not the middles. So, but the body needs to be stretched. The exercise is what that's for, and learning new things is to stretch. And sometimes it doesn't come voluntarily. You're forced to learn or do something, and then you work back to homeostasis or equilibrium, and that's where the fun part is, the joy in life. Is like, oh, I can do this and I can get back there and I can do that again.
So, Ken, what I really particularly enjoyed while you were talking about negotiating to the point where everybody's equally unhappy is who you were being while you said that. That look right there, the grin. It's almost like there's a personal share there.
Oh, many, I
Yeah.
mean, it's yeah, and and honestly, it's been interesting because one of the things that I learned from it was to determine as quickly as possible where someone is, what result they're looking for in a negotiation. And if, and I actually had a negotiation over a possible business acquisition at one point, and I said, I'm looking for a way here for all of us to benefit from this. And his response was, the only one I'm concerned about benefiting from this is me. And I said, okay, we're done talking. I said, really, honestly, best of luck for you. But that's just, we're coming from a different place. We're really not going to come to any kind of agreement because what you're looking to achieve is very different from what I'm looking to achieve. And he was totally cool with it. And we are like, you know what, you're right. We're wasting each other's time, and onward we went. That was it. And it was a lot less stressful than other negotiations where I'm like trying to get to a resolution where they're just never thought to ask, well, what does that look like to you? so and it's funny because that's when it becomes fun, because if you've decided that you can both agree that you're going to play this game by uh you know a set of values and rules that you can both play within, now you can challenge each other, you can push hands, and you're working together really through those challenges and even the missteps to get to a resolution you can agree on, and you do smile, you know and instead of feeling threatened or taken advantage of, or all the other feelings that are going to come up if you're not starting from an pre-agreed upon place.
Yeah, and there's also a lever there, which basically says we've come from a culture that says everyone's got to be equally dissatisfied, otherwise we haven't negotiated properly. And what that does is start the clock ticking to when it's over. Whatever was there that was not resolved and put into the partnership category on day one will continue to sit there until it becomes the most dominating thing in the world in the conversation or the relationship. And I say that's one of the main reasons that we have so many people who start things together, whether it's, personal relationships or marriage or business partnerships or even working, for other people, that they're almost always going in with the idea of, like you said, what I think I know about this situation is all there is to know about it. And that's the confine, and that's where the all of the energy is spent to try to work inside of a space that doesn't fit.
Can I make a book recommendation
Sure.
that kind of goes along with this that I find helpful? It's by a ex FBI guy. His name's Chris Voss, and he wrote a book on negotiation called Never Split the Difference. And what I found interesting about it was he's not a proponent of win-win or compromise. He said keep pushing until you find the solution that allows everybody to win at a higher level than you thought was possible. And it's a very interesting paradigm that's different from like kind of like the Stephen Covey type stuff that added another element. And I'm sure it doesn't work all the time, but it was just like another tool for the toolbox. And it, you know, and he developed a lot of this through like hostage negotiation and really, and then he brought it into the business world, and a lot of the principles relate over. But that's the name of it, is Never Split the Difference. So interesting book.
Sounds something like something that could be used daily with grandchildren. So I'm interested, Jan, with regard to the whole idea of integration with regard to personality and you know people's spirituality and those sorts of things. Do you have any thoughts in terms of methods or practices that people can engage in that would allow them to be on that that particular path?
I think my favorite is just, um, you know, is, well, I do love yoga because I feel like it, especially because it kind of incorporates both the, a really nice yoga practice where I'm not talking about, something, I don't know, I think of it much more methodical and much more, I want to say deliberate. It's not, I don't know, it's different. It is meditation and movement. So it's quiet, it's real thoughtfulness. It's spending time with yourself, which I think is key to integration. Um, you know, and always to me, I go back to that, and the breath, is really, for me, it's really spending time alone and in quiet to connect in. I think that one is, if we're coming to a place of where we're going to go into something like a negotiation, or where we don't feel threatened, or we don't feel like we have to get on the defensive, then we kind of have to really come from a place of centeredness, and a place where we, I want to say, don't, you know, kind of know where we stand with, not in a combative sort of way. It's just like, okay, this is who I am. For me, that's always valuable. And if I can do that before I go and I engage, before I go into something like, I mean, there's stuff you can't predict.
Yeah.
But even the stuff you can't predict, if you start there, it's always better. you know, you kind of reached a higher, you're in a higher place, not higher like above someone, but a higher part of yourself, or the best part, or the best of yourself when you
Yeah.
come into a situation.
And I think that's a perfect goal, to always be better at the end of the sentence than you were at the beginning of the sentence, whatever the sentence is, a day, a week, a month, conversation, workout, whatever. While you were speaking, the thing that I kind of got left with was, you're familiar with body language making a huge difference in children's lives and adults' lives, and there are people that do TED Talks on power poses, and standing in your superhero pose with your arms and knuckles in your sides for 2 full minutes, or in with your arms up and holding that pose, breathing and filling yourself up with all there is to get the goosebumps, all the rest of that. And then what they found with people testing, it was a very strong tool for people to differentiate themselves in an environment where they were applying for a job, for example. And it was a blind test where they went in and they had people who were like a group of 40 individuals all applying for the same job, and they had 5 of those individuals do the power pose with a group of interviewers, and the rest of them not do it. And what they found was the people in the power pose were sitting there and really engaged in all the questions fully participating in it and always being confident enough to say, I don't know. And the rest of the people sat there and were fidgety and, all that kind of thing. And their mind was off racing someplace else and not engaged in the moment. So then they switched it around because they hadn't told anybody other than the groups that they were preparing. They switched it around and they had the groups change. And the people who had been the power posers now became the interviewers. And they did their power pose before interviewing. And then the people who had been not doing the power pose, they turned around and did the power pose. And what they found was at the end of all of the interviews and everything, everyone who had done the power pose would have received a job offer. They all walked in with very similar credentials. The only difference was, who are you being in the interview? And the moral of the story that I took away is how you find your inner authenticity is to stand there for 2 minutes in a power pose and let it come to you. And now you're ready to deal with whatever comes on. I just think it's really, that's like, I want to teach all 5-year-olds how to do that, instead of the strategies that we do teach them, arguing.
Mm-hmm.
So yoga, meditation. Lisa, any thoughts?
No, I was just going to say there's a reason that yoga is an integral part of mindfulness practice.
Yeah.
It's all getting back to that centeredness, the I am of I am kind of thing, as they say in the spiritual practices. Always get back to who's the I am that's witnessing all these things. Get back to the real eyes of seeing things.
Yeah, I always found in yoga that I discovered new parts of my body that I didn't know exist because they became very pained.
But it's where you really learn how to breathe into parts when they bother you. I mean, it never made sense to me till I did yoga. Like if there's a part that's bothering, breathe into it. I probably the first time I was, blatantly aware of being in the moment was doing yoga. And another part of yoga was that I learned how not to have to be perfect. We grew up in a thing where you were in a class and you just had to follow the teacher regardless of your ability or anything like that, but you had to follow it perfectly. And yoga, we always learned that no, that's not the case. You do you.
Yeah, in the style I practice, we call doing you is you're working with your internal blueprint, and you're always working toward that internal blueprint. You're not working to somebody else's.
Mm-hmm.
You're working to your own internal blueprint, your internal, which is whatever your genetics, your structure, your anatomy, your emotional, whatever. It's integrating all of that, or at least coming to a place like where when you work, that's where you're working toward.
Yeah. What was said to me is, you are not here to serve the art is here to serve you.
Just letting that soak in, because what I found when I started running again, after I'd convinced myself 10 years ago I never would, because I have no cartilage in my knees, that's my story, is I just really love getting to minute number 10 while I'm running. And for the next 10 or 15 minutes, just being in that space of being in motion, and really more than anything, just picking up glimpses of what's going by as I'm running through my house. But being left with that 5 minutes went by in a flash. There was really, it was like no time. It couldn't have been 5 minutes, but it is, or 10 minutes. But the other part of it too is to have things just kind of come down to where if you close your eyes for a minute and you just listen to yourself breathe. I don't know if anybody else does that, but that is a very similar experience for me as well. which isn't quite meditating, but it's more along the lines of just taking 5 minutes and listening to rhythmic breathing and getting lost in that to the point where the thinking disappears for a little while and absolutely new ideas and thoughts. And 5 minutes is an amazing amount of time to be rejuvenated in, and everybody has 5 minutes.
Absolutely. I mean, I love that. And I mean, I always tell people not even 5 minutes, like begin with minutes, less,
Mhm.
and even, work your way up. But I think when you were talking about that with the running, that was the first thing I thought about was the fact it's like when you do get into a zone, when you sit or you're with your breath, and all of a sudden 5 minutes goes by and you're like, oh, that was 5 minutes, or 10 minutes goes by and you're like, oh, okay, you know, and there is almost like that no comprehension of time, like time stops to some extent.
Yeah, my favorite part of yoga after I was in the hospital and I had pericarditis back in 2008. One of the things that I did to try to regain some shape in my body was to do a yoga uh, workout. It was a videotape. It took exactly 1 hour, start to finish. Where and any of you that have done that type of regimented yoga, that exactly how much time is left based on what your poses you're doing right now. But my most favorite part was the cool down afterwards, because the tape would go silent at the end of it, and there wasn't any completion, to the workout after the cool down. And that cool down could go 35, 40 minutes for me, just lying there quietly. Sometimes I'd fall asleep, you know?
Mhm.
It was just such a comforting way to spend an hour or an hour and a half, in some cases, maybe 2 hours, who knows?
I always found it
Yeah.
interesting too. You could lie down at the beginning of a yoga class and it would hurt, just be flat on your back. But
Yeah,
after doing a whole session of yoga and you lie down, you don't even notice it. You're just like there, and you could fall asleep. Where if you did it before yoga, that would never happen.
it
It-
would.
and I
The
always think
breath.
that, sorry, Ken, go ahead.
Oh, no, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that I always say to people is like when you lie down at the end and you almost feel like you're a part of the earth, like
Mhm.
you're a part of the ground, or
Mhm.
you're a part of your mat,
Yeah.
and you're like, and the earth is there because it's, earth supports us, but there's almost no feeling of it. It's just like your body's like, okay, I'm just settled, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Taoist yoga practices that I was taught, you're noticing a state of heavy weightlessness,
Mhm.
which makes no sense until you've experienced it, and it's really kind of cool. So it's what you're talking about, but at the same time, there's almost like a floatiness to it,
Mhm.
even though you're part of the earth. It's really interesting.
I think that feeling that we're talking about is what draws people back. Like, I think that's
Mm,
what gets people to come back to yoga over and over again because, you're always working with variations of whatever poses there are, which there are like, I don't know, 100 something.
mm,
And not that you do them all. A lot of them I can't do, and that's not the point, but you're always working on variations of those. So the practice itself doesn't really change. It's that
yeah.
feeling that people want. It's kind of like you experience it and then people are like, "Oh, I want that. Like I love the way that feels. I want to get back there." And
Yeah.
sometimes you're successful and sometimes you're not. And that's just the way. It's like you're like, okay, if we're trying to like, I mean, as human beings, we kind of evaluate everything. Like that was a good practice or a bad practice. And my teacher once said, practice like failing yoga is like failing life, like you can't it's not possible.
Yeah.
It's just like
As long as
Yeah.
you keep getting back up, right?
that's right, exactly, or as long as you keep getting on your mat or whatever, wherever you practice, and so then it's it.
Yeah,
Oh,
there's always
Bill, I was
Shiva.
going to say, running wise, the breath can create a very cool meditative state while running. Actually, one of the techniques, and I like this on longer recovery runs where you're not putting as much effort in, it's just all nose breathing.
Yeah.
And you just like, you put a sip of water in your mouth, you hold it for like a mile. So, you just don't swallow it. You just let it, so it keeps your jaw relaxed and it keeps your attention on rhythmic breath in and out the nose, which helps you, go from working too hard or anything like that. And then drink the water, spit it out or whatever, do it again. But it's interesting when you're in that rhythmic breathing state, you really lose a sense of time.
Yeah.
Like an hour goes by and it's just like you're not sure what happened to it. It's really cool.
That's a
Part
good
of what,
takeaway for me. I appreciate it.
and part of what that does is it balances the nervous system by nose breathing,
Yep.
by inhaling and exhaling through the nose. So it balances the nervous system. And in yoga, we always say your mouth is for eating and your nose is for breathing. And so we
I like
always,
that.
in general, you breathe in and out through your nose. And I've been in situations where, like, I'm so used to breathing in and out through my nose now that if I go to the doctor and the doctor will say inhale, and they have to actually say, no, we mean through your mouth, because it's so not like normal to me anymore.
Yeah. It's funny while you mention that, Jan. When I was going to the University of Colorado, I had some very good friends that were Pueblo Indians, and one young man I got to be very close with, and so we had all these different conversations about cultural norms and everything. I asked him one time. I said, "What is? I mean, what is the worst slur for white people that you guys have?" And he said, "Yeah, we call you all mouth breathers." He said, if you ever take the time to sit down and then, and breathe through your nose and breathe all the way down to your toenails, you'll start to get an understanding of who you really are.
Mhm.
And again, all of these things, which are almost a koan of a metaphor in terms of it is language and conversation, but it allows you to really get into an inquiry, and start digging in. And during that same semester, as you were talking about sinking into the earth, I got interested in a book on astral projection. And I don't know if any of you have ever read anything about that, but there actually were steps in a methodology to go through, getting into a meditative state and then visualizing a window, a small window, and then opening that window and becoming small enough with a silver thread around your waist that you could go through that window and up into the beyond. And the neat part of it is I got to that point where I actually felt like my being was outside my body, in my dorm room, and I hadn't taken any mind-altering substances, so that was off the list. And I got to the point where I panicked because I really felt like I was completely outside of my body. It scared the what out of me, and I never did it again. But the next two times that I experienced that were near death experiences that I had that came after one, I suffocated in a submarine water retaining tank with argon. And then the next time was when I was in a car accident and lost consciousness, but I could see myself and I was hovering over the situation. And, you know, I love having these conversations because it's like these little things fire. These are triggers that have been sitting there inactive for forever. And we all have, this body of knowledge that the moment that we're willing to allow it, to come through. And this is the thing, that I want to interject here in terms of the integration and equilibrium. For a lot of people, equilibrium is when you're not thinking about anything other than the mundane. Do you know what I mean? Where equilibrium isn't necessarily that you're challenging your intellect, and your most difficult thinking and all those sorts of things. And I really wonder if that's what's missing for a lot of people. They say we only use 20% of our entire brain in our entire life, right? So whether they say that or not, it really isn't important. But if we use that as a metaphor for what's possible, if you were able to come up with practices that would challenge you to go to different parts of your brain. And I'll give you one more example, and then I want to hear what you all have to say about maybe from your own personal experience. But we were sitting here over the weekend, my wife Janet and I, and we were talking about a really desperate situation where a young boy had been killed, and that led her to say, uh, back in the 1970s, there was a young girl over in another part of our community. A similar thing happened to. And I want to say I haven't uttered this for all those years. And the young girl's name was Dawn Peterson. And so I said, "That's Dawn Peterson." It's like it was in neon in front of my eyes. And she went and queried it, and it actually was. And we haven't talked about that since 1977. So if we had a way to go and find those file cabinets where the useful stuff is through our experiences and all the really, the cool things that we need in those moments where we're desperate and we're not quite sure how to react to things, I just wonder how would we go about doing something like that. I'm good for now.
Well, you said it's a prompt, so my thought is that's what's going to unlock that memory, or my sister calls it shark music, or unlock that emotion. That you forgot that hit you in a bad way so many years ago, and then it's bringing up that trauma again. But I think just like our conversations here, every time somebody brings up one thing, somebody else remembers uh, another piece that relates to it, and it could be. I mean, we all have different experiences from it, so it's kind of interesting when that happens. But I think obviously a trigger or a memory is something that's going to bring it out in you. If there was a way to, and you could provide your own triggers, your own, but I could do that by watching some YouTube videos. I go, oh yeah, I remember that. I learned that from somebody else many years ago, or like Ken does with the books, and or I bring up a YouTube video or a famous person that said this about that. It's kind of, I think it's all there, but it would be interesting if we could just access it voluntarily. Like I want to know about the moon right now. Let me open up that file.
Well, the really cool thing about being in conversation, especially with people that you trust, okay, is that it's going to unlock those areas you don't know that you don't know you've forgotten.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, I really appreciate the cliche of folks saying, you don't know, you don't know. And all that is that's that opportunity to grow. That's that opportunity to start asking new, better questions. And the neat part of it is that if you do this with different groups of people, some like family, or over the last 3 years, our high school graduating class has really gotten to be very good friends on Facebook. And so we get together socially, and we have these great old conversations, and always something comes up that I had forgotten that ever happened. And then it was back there as vividly as in my memory as when it actually did happen, or that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Well, maybe as you're saying, and from what Lisa was saying, the stuff that we don't know, and maybe that's just keeping, as we do here, keeping the conversation going, because every conversation triggers a different file in the memory bank. And so it's just keeping the conversations going between different individuals, because this way, I mean, yes, it would be nice to trigger those things before you had the conversation, you know, and maybe those are much more things that are conversations with yourself. So maybe, you know, I mean, if you talk out loud to yourself, people might think you're crazy, you know, I talk to myself all the time. Lisa too. But people might say I'm crazy. But, is maybe, keeping in conversation, obviously, like we have here, but maybe it is having conversations with yourself, or, those thoughts.
You don't know what you do know is what I've been saying lately. I mean, that, like, most recently, it's like you don't know what you know, because I forget things I know till somebody prompts it in me, and then I'll go, well, if you try
Mhm.
this, and then they go, how do you know that? And I go, well, it's there.
I'm wondering if you circle back around, if this isn't all just symptomatic of integration.
Mhm.
You know, because like if you're, let's use running, if you've got a good pair of running shoes, you don't notice them because they're doing their job as part of an integrated experience that we call running.
Yeah.
So, but you know, from the second you buy them, you bought a pair of eventually worn out running shoes. So, so at some point they're not going to be good running shoes anymore, and then like your knee starts to hurt, and now you access what you know about the benefit of a proper pair of running shoes is the equipment you need to run safely. So you notice it, you replace them, then you forget again until you need to notice it again. It's funny. We do this. We have this 5-step approach to training, you know, in our businesses, and it's this thing where it's teach, support, feedback, accountability. Integration is the final step, and that final step is a caution to remember that when someone's truly integrated their skill set into the team, you'll forget what a good job they're doing. So sometimes you have to step back and remember, you know, they've almost become invisible because they're just doing it the way it's supposed to be done, you know? So you got to like remind them, hey, we still notice you. We appreciate it. What you're doing has value. It's just you're so good at it, you know, we don't notice. Like if you watch football, you only notice the offensive line when they mess up. You know, you know, the center messes up the snap and there's a fumble. Everybody's looking at the center, but the other 60 snaps that went perfectly, no one's looking at them. They're looking at the quarterback, you know? So maybe there's that part of it too, where it's okay if we forget because there's no need for us to invest the energy in remembering at that moment.
Well, and as you're talking, and I'm sitting there thinking of the physical body, because most of the time, if we're working optimally, you know, we don't really notice quite a number of parts of our body, and then all of a sudden, obviously, when we get hurt or we get injured, and all of a sudden that area of the body becomes very, very loud. Like we notice it a lot, you know, and you know, and that, and so that just reminded me of what you were saying. We don't notice stuff until all of a sudden, and whether it be a football player or
Yeah.
someone who's supposed to do their job, like is not doing all those 5 levels of your, let's say, training, um, personnel training or levels, when something's
Yeah.
missing on their behalf, all of a sudden, I'm sure that, you notice that, right? So,
I remember when I blew out my shoulder, you know, for like all of a sudden realizing how hard it is to tie your shoes with one hand
Yeah.
or
right.
put on a sock, you know, or even shampoo your hair. It was crazy the things that you take for granted. You're right, because it was just integrated. And all of a sudden that's like removed. And now you have this massive realization of just the value that were just taking for granted for so long, you
Mhm.
know?
And I think it's always very humbling. Like it's like,
Oh
it's
yeah.
like almost like this humbling feeling of, I fractured my right forearm, my radius. So that has to do with rotation and everything. And so opening up a bottle or a doorknob
Yeah.
all of a sudden becomes a really big deal. And, how do you open up a bottle when you can't stabilize with that arm and you're trying to use both
Hmm.
hands? So all of a sudden you're using your knees to wedge
Yep.
something. You use your strong hand. And so, so it is humbling because all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, and it's humbling in the fact that you might have to ask for help. And I always love saying they might have to ask because with this sort of trepidation, it's like, oh my gosh, I might have to rely on someone else,
Yeah.
And see, right there's the magic, okay? Because we started off, and Lisa, again, the definition of integration was the act of integrating. Is that,
Yeah, a brilliant statement. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah? And here's what I hear about it. It's a tense in terms of while the action of integrating is going on, that's integration. So when you get to what Ken was talking about, where everything fits together and it's now not noticed as being a part, it's integrated, and integrity is there, full integrity,
Mhm.
and a little bit different in of a definition than integrity being good, or you're a person of your word, or you always do the right thing, or that sort of thing. How about integrity as just being complete and whole? You know, like the integrity of a balloon. You know, if any part of that balloon is not present, it's now just a lump of rubber on the floor. Or integrity of the hull of a ship or a submarine. You know, really noticeable quickly on a submarine when the hull integrity is not good. So when you're thinking of it being more about being complete and whole, as opposed to putting things together, um, in you know, I think the cultural definition of integration that my generation grew up with really kind of got us off track from what was really possible. And it's not necessarily the idea that you put things into a stew and they're no longer identifiable as what they once were. It's more about let them celebrate, you know, the carrots, you know, the peas, you know, the beef, you know, the fish if you do a fish stew, all of those little individual things that are like aha moments when you come across them. And that gives you the integrity of the whole group. That every once in a while, because it's a natural thing to happen, you do notice that somebody's been doing a damn good job. You know how I know? I haven't had to talk to you in a week. You know, are you okay? You know, that sort of thing. So the whole idea of a group or a culture or something having a completeness and wholeness, while all of the particles are distinct and they bear the DNA and the history of where they came from, and they're helping to make the, you know, the conversation that much better, richer, whatever you want to call it. You know, I like, you know, when you say, do you guys all agree that the more times that you reheat stew, the better it gets?
Yes.
I think that's a good metaphor for culture as well. The more often you allow the ingredients to express themselves for who they are and as they are, you know, as opposed to being, you know, I mean, I never got into bay leaf. You know, I mean, it never really made sense to me when I got a bay leaf and that was in the middle of this beautiful, delicious stew. It's like, man, that's not cool. I mean, it's like who wants to be the person that gets the bay leaf? I mean, tell me if I'm wrong here. I mean, I want to get the bay leaf, said no one ever, you know. But everyone's mom had to put a bay leaf in there. I don't even know if they remember why we do that anymore.
Oh, and I always heard that it was, we always like, I don't know, I've been places where they say it's lucky to get bay leaf, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure they said that or if it was just a result of what you just said. No one wants to get it, and they decided to make it fun.
And a good chef will take it out first.
And you can always tell
exactly.
what culture you came from by whether or not you're looking forward to getting the worm in the bottle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I think the neat thing in terms of having a mini celebration every week, and this week in terms of talking about equilibrium and integration, what I'm coming away with is that for me, the equilibrium is when I'm not being challenged in a moment, I'm at rest. Do you know what I mean? It's like a book on a shelf. Its highest and best use is to be in somebody's lap being looked at, you know, and challenging their intellect and challenging their thinking ability and challenging whatever it is that's challenged, you know, like, you know, the visuals. Were you guys all big readers when you were kids?
Yes.
Yeah. And that does two things for you, by the way. It allows you to learn a lot of words that you have no idea how they're pronounced. That's a very cool thing, where you get to go out and say in front of people for the first time a word and you say it very badly. And the other thing that it does is it allows you to create these monster visuals. I think more than listening to audiobooks, I think listening or reading a typed book allows me, in my experience, to have these unbelievably rich visuals that get created. And oftentimes they don't look anything like the movie, you know? Well, we're not quite at the end here, but did we miss anything? Is there something that if we don't get into it, our folks at home they're gonna be hanging on their, you know, the edge of their seat until next week?
I have a little story about talking to yourself. And because I don't know if you know who Jean Houston is, but she's a motivational woman. But her father was John Houston, and he knew Edgar Bergen.
Yeah.
And he brought her over to visit them one day, and they were standing outside the door, and they could hear Edgar talking to Charlie McCarthy. Edgar was asking Charlie McCarthy a question, and Charlie was answering. So John Houston burst into the door. He goes, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm asking Charlie McCarthy a question." And he goes, "Well, why are you asking?" He goes, "Because he's smarter than I am."
I love it. And for those of you at home, Charlie McCarthy was a ventriloquist dummy.
Right.
And he was
But
a lot
smarter than
smarter,
Edgar Bergen.
no doubt about it. Even Candace said that.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic. And my college psychology professor said, it's not a problem to talk to yourself. He said, you're getting into a weird area when you start answering. You might want to watch that. But other than that, you should talk to yourself. Because most of the time, it's not you talking to you. The question that's coming out is something that's coming from a completely unknown situation, and it really isn't you talking at all. Oh, thanks a lot, Chuck. Well, any final thoughts?
My only other one was like, there's a reason I love casseroles. The more things together, the better, and that includes people.
So agree with you. Everyone deserves to create a situation where they can both grow and be amazed every single day of their life. And I think that mostly happens in conversation with other human beings, regardless of who they are. That's my humble experience.
I think I just have to say, but I think the key is staying in conversation, because I think you can have amazing experiences, by yourself in nature. And you can really, maybe it's not the same, but I think you can. And I think it's just staying in conversation, whatever that is, to find that amazement.
Yeah, and while you're speaking, I'm thinking for myself that it's really cool to experience those beautiful things with nature with another human being to
Yes.
share.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also something to be said for being on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Like part of a fully functioning adult is to be able to have it all ways. Any last thoughts, Lisa?
I'm good. I am complete.
Mr. Ken?
No, this is very enjoyable. I learned some things.
That's why I get on here every week.
Yeah.
It's remarkable to me how little I actually know. And that's why I like to have a lot of smart people around. And thank you all for fulfilling that part of the dream. And ladies and gentlemen, it's been another hour, and we are lighting the candle, A World That Works. If you found our podcast, you can find it here, or you can just Google Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, and it will give you lots of different instances of podcast platforms that you can come and listen to us. And we really want you to keep thinking and sending us your energy, because this is where we draw all these really cool thoughts from. When we have a good podcast, it's because we're listening to you, the people that will be listening to this in the future. So thank you very much. And everyone have a wonderful week. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week, as well as the rest of the network, at exvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.